Since this morning, we've had individuals coming on this platform and really speaking their heart out, really telling the stories that they have lived or gone through. Well, we'll continue this art of storytelling in our next conversation as well, because this one is actually titled as Stories of Our Past Retold for Our Future. Now, you see, one of the biggest inhibition any new writer has is that the story that they're trying to say would probably be already said in some form or the other. Now, this next conversation is going to talk about that and much more. We have with us Mr. Deepak Ramola, who is the founder and artistic director of the project Fuel, a two-time TED Talk speaker and UN Action Plan executor. He serves as the Kindness Ambassador for UNESCO MGIEP. His first collection of Hindi poetry titled Itna To Main Samajh Gaya Hu received the prestigious Dwarka Prasad Agarwal Young Writers Award in 2020. His first English book, 50 Toughest Question of Life, recently got published as well. In conversation with him, we have Karuna Ezara Parikh, who's a former model and TV show host. She is known widely for her writing and activism. Her debut novel, The Heart Asks Pleasure First, released with Pan Macmillan India has received rave reviews in the last year. And she has a book of poetry releasing with HarperCollins this fall as well. She's the co-founder of the sustainable company, The Burlap People. So another conversation coming your way. Enjoy this one.
Hi everyone, my name is Deepak Ramola and I am in conversation today with the amazing Karuna Ezara Parikh. Hi Karuna.
Hi Deepak, how are you?
I'm very good and I'm so excited to just explore, this theme of the stories that we borrow from the past and we sort of carry forward to the future. Both of us as writers, as storytellers do that so often. And there is this particular story, Karuna, that I find myself going back to, which I was dying to share with you. It's a story about a man who was very, very tensed. And he went to the seminar, the sermon that Muji, the great philosopher or spiritual leader, was delivering. And the man sort of stopped him mid-session and said, I need to speak to you right now. And Muji said, can we do this after I'm finished with my sermon? And he said, no, you don't understand the gravitas of this challenge. I have to speak to you right now. So Muji says, okay, cool. I will stop this and I will pay attention to you. If you can tell me, what was your biggest problem 3 problems ago? And the man sort of, I think like most of us, and at least like me, freezes thinking, what was it? And cannot recollect. I borrow that story into my writing whenever I'm having a block, whenever I'm in life's challenging situations. Are there stories or incidents that you borrow from culture and tradition that you see yourself returning to?
Oh goodness, that's such a big question to begin with. Thanks, Deepak. Firstly, that's such a wonderful story that you just said. And it comes to me at such a perfect time, as stories do, because I've actually been going through a very difficult time in my life. I've been moving house, as you know, and, moving spaces is traumatic. I think we put down roots as humans. We start nesting as humans. And, sort of just ripping those roots out to restart, it can be deeply traumatic. And so it's been a very difficult time for me. And last night I was sitting on my couch and I was thinking to myself, I can't remember the last time I was this stressed out. I can't remember the last time. And suddenly that sentence struck me. And I said, see, you can't remember when you were last this stressed out. And similarly, you will not remember this. And later you will be left with the joys of it. So I think that story has come to me at such a fantastic moment in my life when I really needed it, I think. About my own stories, gosh, there is a theory amongst writers that, you yourself would have heard about, Deepak, which is that there are no new stories. We are forever telling the older stories. We are telling them in new ways. The Mahabharata is something that is a perfect example of this. They say it contains every single story that one would tell again and again, or Shakespeare, for example, right? most scenarios that we see in movies and in plays and in art today, they say have already been written by one of the greats in the past. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I know it's, as a writer of fiction, it is damn hard for me to come up with a new story. So when I wrote my book, The Heart Asks Pleasure First, which we've already spoken about so much together, when I wrote my book, I knew I was telling a story that has been told in the past. It's a story of a Hindu Indian girl and a Pakistani Muslim boy. And it's a love story. We've heard it 100 times over. But I think what makes it different in the retelling is our voices. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, because the treatment becomes so different, right? Because I think every human being is different. So our treatment of a story will be different. And I feel, for example, what you've written, the 50 toughest questions of life, there's so many people who've tried to say that in the past as well, right? But if you look at old Chinese proverbs, if you look at haikus from Japan, if you look at these lessons, if you look at Kabir's dohas, these are all different ways of telling, right? These lessons have been around for years, but I think the way you've done it is so beautiful and unique, and it is so for the present, right? That's the other thing, that I think we are so much. Every writer is so much a product of their own time.
So beautifully said. That is true. And I think when I am sitting down to pen something, which is a story that I feel is almost a breakpoint cliche, or is so conventional that I can feel it in my bone marrow, not just my bone, I feel I can switch the track by forgiving at intervals where the audiences doesn't expect that forgiveness to come. Or I can take the tenacity of the character or of the thought 15 seconds longer than where it was supposed to end. And I think those sort of choreography changes to the usual routine allow for us this room to retell stories. And I was reading something so beautiful the other day, Karuna, by Jim Harrison, and he said, "Death steals everything except for our stories." And I literally had that moment where I put my hand on my chest and I was like,
wow, because our souls carry stories forward, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I read that and I thought about this conversation that you and I were going to have, and I thought, isn't it interesting that even loss seems like a gain in a sentence like that? Which Jim Morrison has beautifully crafted. But he said, it steals everything, yet, it cannot rob us of our stories. Do you feel that the stories that we are telling and retelling somehow craft our legacies, or in some way preserve our essence? Like, are you the kind of writer or the kind of, storyteller who cares about that at all?
I think every writer does, right? Somewhere deep down, you want to be remembered for your work. But, I think it's so much deeper than that as well. I think that, each person, regardless of whether they're writing down their stories or publishing their stories, we are living our stories, right? And what I often feel is that is what remains of you, right? So, for example, you might have a grand aunt who was just a fabulous lady and lived a very full, wonderful life. She may not have had a traditional career or had success in a way that one remembers, or that will be written about in books. But later, after this grand aunt passes, let's say, and you're gathered as a family, you will keep telling the stories about her. And it might be some, and I have that in my family. I'm sure you have it in yours. I think everyone has that. And what she is left behind are her stories. And gosh, that's quite precious, right? And so I think whether you're writing them down as an author, whether you're being published, I think it's sort of a reminder to live life to its fullest and with leaving behind as many stories as possible. But I want to go back to what you were talking about just before this. You were discussing how you change how you forgive, right? And how you change what the audience expects. And I think in retelling stories, one of the most um, things with agency, let's say, that we can do as writers is change the ending, right? And it's such a powerful tool to have as a writer, that you decide what happens. And especially for someone like me writing about partition and the effects of partition in fiction, I think for me, the powerful thing was perspective, because time gives you perspective. And when you're retelling stories from the past, what you have that a writer before you didn't have is perspective. And I think, perspective can easily be turned into wisdom if you spend time with it, and if you look at it through the right lens. And so effectively, what you can bring to a story that someone before you perhaps didn't is, because you have the tool of perspective, you can bring new wisdoms. And as you said, bring new endings. So I think that is the magic also of retelling stories.
I love that. I love that. And I am the biggest cheerleader and champion of the thought, when in schools you're taught that solutions are formulas. Like if you do this and you get this degree and you get this job and everything will be fine. I'm so wary of that suggestion, because I feel those are the narratives that kind of, label formulas into this ever success mechanism. But what you said, perspectives allow you room to change it, and allow you, some sort of I think a different outlook towards the routine and the usual. It's quite phenomenal, actually.
Yeah, it really is. Because, like, for example, my book deals so much with the stories of that partition left behind. And we have a friend in common, Anchal Malhotra, who writes so much about partition and remnants of separation. And she's the one who actually made me see that my book is a book about partition. And, people have called it a love story, people have called it a political story, people have called it, but she's like, no, this is a book about the effects of partition. And I was like, that's so true. I didn't think of that. And then I began to see what I was doing with it was exactly that. I was taking perspective, and I was taking this passage of time between 1947 and now, and I was able to tell a story of love rather than a story of hate, because now enough time has passed for that, So yeah, it was.
I'm so relieved you wrote the book, because so many young people that I'm sure you meet too often don't even begin that process because they feel they lack an original idea. And I'm again, very, very flimsy on this. What is an original idea? Because everything has its roots in some inspiration, right? And if you wait an eternity for an original idea, when will it come? And many people don't really want to retell a story in their own voice, which you said beautifully in the beginning. They just wait for a newer voice to emerge, which I think is the contradiction of the very thought of telling a story, because the moral is the same. It's a handful of things. And the premise is constantly changing, whether you are Karuna Ezra, sitting in Calcutta, or whether you're Deepak Ramola sitting in Dehradun. You're trying to drive the same point home.
Yeah.
But maybe you're showing partition as a landscape, and I'm showing the hills, or some story from a woman in the mountains, right?
Yeah. I think that this thing about finding one's voice and finding an original story, I think it's more like just finding yourself, right? And I think I tried to write this book for 13 years. Well, let's say I restarted about 4 years ago. So let's say 9, 10 years I tried before I started writing this version. And so in a weird, very meta sense, I've been retelling my own story for 10 years. I'm trying to retell my own story for 10 years. And again, what I needed was perspective, right? So 10 years passed, and then I re-attempted it for like the 100th time or something. And this time I could write it. And the reason I could write it was because I had found more of myself and I'd found my voice. And I think people wait so much for an original idea, for an original idea. Let's just keep it at that. But you are the original idea. You finding self is because there's no one like you. And we know that each individual is so different. And when you bring your truest, rawest self to the page, I think it does resonate. And, it's just so crazy to me because, you've read Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. It's the same story again and again and again. And it kind of drove me crazy at some point when I was reading it. I was like, oh, human beings never break the cycle. That's what's going on here. But the beauty of it is that you do and you can. And at some point, the cycle breaks. And that's freedom, right? And so, yeah, sorry, coming back to what I was saying about finding one's voice and finding an original idea. So my idea is not original. If you think about it, like I said, it's been done so many times over. And later, after writing it, I realized that is the magic of it. And I felt like, for a long time, I felt, it's been done, but chalo, theek hai, my voice is different, my treatment is different. And what was so beautiful for me was that once the book was published, I have been flooded with messages and emails and letters saying, this is my story too. And so I think the idea of finding an original story, it's totally bogus. There are no original stories, as we know. And in fact, it's better if you write a story that really resonates, I think. And you can't help but write a story that resonates. And I think even if you find the weirdest story in the world, you're going to find one other person in the world who's like, that is my story too. And I think that's the beauty of humans, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So much of intersection. My dad actually, when I was writing 50 Toughest Question and had one of those days when I was like, no fresh idea has come into my brain. And I often say writing is like praying and cursing at the same time. It's like, I just want something and damn, it's not happening. And my dad used to say, he's a chef. And during the writing process, he would see me some days so muffled and muddled. And he used to say, if I wait for an original recipe to come to me, you would stay hungry and malnourished all your life. And it was such a great metaphor and analogy.
That is so super because, if you think of writers as chefs, it's so true. And, there's this thing about khichdi. I don't know, that no house makes khichdi the same way.
Yes.
Even if they make it in the same method, it doesn't taste the same. And no hand makes khichdi. And I've thought about that. I'm like, that's impossible. But it's true. Have you ever had two khichdis that taste the same, in two different places?
Never.
So yeah. And yet they're all khichdis, the same way. They're all stories. They're all books. But, the magic is that the individual makes them different. The hand that writes it is different. So, yeah. Your book is fantastic. Now I've actually, since the last time we spoke, I've actually dipped into it so I do this thing where I open it and I read a random page.
That's a great way.
Yeah, and with your book, one can do that. With my book, it'll be like, spoiler, but I actually enjoy doing that so much, and it actually gives me, great courage. I wanted to tell you on some days, so thank you.
Oh wow! I'm so honored to hear that, and I'm so glad you wrote like a linear story, and I wrote like literally a khichdi where you could eat from anywhere at any point. I also feel it really was necessary for me to be able to write this book because, when we think about wisdom, we often sort of categorize it to these sage level, high intellectual people. And it becomes really the cream that rises on the top, and people don't see the milk as the wisdom in that metaphoric sense. I have spent, as you know, like almost my entire life, over 13 years documenting stories of people. And sometimes if I close my eyes during an interview at Project Fuel, erase the name and the face of the person that I'm speaking with, that story could be the one that I heard in Nepal post the earthquake. That story could be my mother's story. Like just the other day, I was doing an interview in, of this tribe in Tanzania. And the woman was talking about how she was removed out of school because her father didn't have enough cattle to pay for her education. Mm-hmm. And the lack of cattle led to this challenge where she couldn't finish her school. And that's the story of my mother. And the two have never even met. But it's the exact same story, the exact same concerns. And I think somewhere we are telling the same story, as you said earlier, because we are living the same lives. And instead of letting it discomfort you, that, oh my God, why am I so similar to others? It's actually in today's mental health challenge and just this crazy pressure of productivity, which I definitely suffer from. Uh, Maybe the assurance is in knowing that your story isn't different. Somebody understands out there what you're going through. And as you said, your voice is by default unique. So if you own up and you tell that in your voice, you will be different, and yet you will be similar. We'll be more alike than unalike, and vice versa.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Deepak. Growing up, I think there was such a focus on being special. Each child needed to be special, and you needed to be like this precious thing that had all these original views and ideas, and maybe you were going to shine, you were going to be the one person in your classroom or your college or whatever it is. And I think that kind of idea is actually quite detrimental. And I think what we should be telling is, exchanging is stories of this kind, and realizing that our stories are universal and that we are not in this alone. And I do think that the pandemic helped in that sense, because so much, the world was a kinder place last year in many ways. And I think that people were listening more to each other. People were spending a lot of time trying to connect overseas, instead of, taking a trip to Mexico and just staying in your resort. People were actually talking to people on the internet from there. I think that there was so much exchange of stories going on. And I do hope that those are the lessons and stories that we keep with us, even though, it looks like nobody, it looks like, with the vaccination and all, life is somewhat going back to normal for many people. But I do hope we hold on to that, because it is what makes us, it makes the human experience more beautiful. And I do think that, all the things that we hope for in the world, whether it's more peace, whether it's more education, whether it's a brighter future, I think so much of it is rooted in this idea that remembering that the other is human as you, and has had the same experiences as you, and that our stories are all the same. So I do hope that we hold on to that.
Do you think we have an undue? I'm in the US at the moment, and I have been having these conversations with people on daily walks that I get to see in a very limited capacity, but that we have an undue or an unfair advantage coming from an Indian culture and access to stories, all the way from the ones that our grandmothers told, to the ones that our epics and our Vedas tell, to whatever our panchatantras and the things we grow up with. Do you think we have an unprecedented access to a pool of stories that we repurpose for our own growth and well-being over time?
I've never thought of that. That is actually so interesting. I do believe that every culture has their own story. I mean, look at Greek culture. I went to college with a huge group of Greek friends, and they were constantly telling these stories. So I don't know if it's necessarily an advantage over other cultures, but I do think it is an advantage, full stop. I will say this. I think the West has, in a sense, that there has been a letting go of the culture of storytelling. Because storytelling also, it definitely involves, or has to by default involve, the idea of a group. And I think that joint families and things like that really helped to tell stories, because stories are also passed down over generations. They are told in large groups. And I think with the Western focus on the individual, and with the decline of the joint family, with such a focus on capitalism, I do think that stories as a commodity have sort of been dying out in the West. And the way stories are told in the West is very much, you have a writer, you have a book, and you read that book alone. So whereas I think that we still have many elements of the old culture of storytelling. I do think that this last year changed that around the world. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years. What do you think about it? Since you're in the US, do you feel I'm right? Do you feel like I'd be curious to hear?
I definitely feel that we are going to end up becoming, those specimens we read about. Like, there's in 10, 50 years, we are going to be the people will ask, how was the pandemic for you? And you lived through that. And then we will be really retelling these stories all over again. But I do agree with you. I think there is now, before the pandemic, I felt that there were only a handful of people who knew how to spend time with themselves, how to be still. It was the monks who, did crazy amount of meditation in the monastery. It was people who really exalted themselves in an exercise or a physical capacity, at the gym for hours, or people like, specific job roles or specific labels in society, who were considered to have found a space and time to be still. The pandemic, I think, allowed that access to everybody, from a child to a mother to a grandparent, and all in the same setting. Now that we know better of that stillness, we don't have to go to a Vipassana necessarily to learn about it. The bigger question is, what are you going to do about it? Because you can't say, I don't know what that feels like. You now know. And how you choose to act upon it is, an action in motion. It's a repetitive, reductive result of that contemplation. So yeah, I agree with you. I think now people know better. My only hope is, I hope they do better. Because if you go back to the old ways, I don't see that as a sustainable way of going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I something you said really struck me. Most people, the language they use for the pandemic, they say, everyone was forced to be still. But you said something so ridiculously beautiful right now, Deepak. You said everyone had access to it. And I think that's such a wonderful way of looking at it, because it was a privilege actually. And we should, at least we should see it as that, even though it didn't always feel like that. And the greatest hope, of course, is that stories come out of it. So I'm very, very curious to see, we haven't had, say, the first really big fiction books written about this time yet. So it'll be lovely to see what, with perspective and with the passage of time, it'll be lovely to see what actually comes from this.
It has definitely unleashed a lot of things within each one of us. And people like you and me, who anyways delve so much into introspection and reflection. Matlab, we go crazy, I think, in the way we try to brew and try to process things inside us. It will be very interesting, even for people like us, what this really morphs into. Because everybody I spoke to, they were like, oh, you must be writing books and books and books. And I said, you know what, I have had like zero inclination to write on most days of the lockdown. I've read, I have watched, and I've cooked, but I don't necessarily know if I wanted to write. And it's been a lot of reflective time. I also feel, just to sum this up, I know we have like a limited time in this conversation.
Are we kind of going over our time? Oh my goodness. This always happens when we talk. It's always like so much to talk about.
So I think, just to wrap this up, I would like to ask you, for any other writer, your book is climbing these amazing charts. And I know it's far beyond that. It's the hand of the reader that's really lusciously going through each page and, drawing what you wanted them to draw from it. But what would you say to a young storyteller anywhere, in the world, who's sitting right now with an empty page and asking, how do I start? Especially with telling a story.
Well, one is to, I'd say, listen hard, because stories are all around us. Look deep within yourself to find the voice to tell that story. Make it very authentically yours. Don't try and copy someone else's voice. It never works. And lastly, live your life, because I think, Deepak, what you and I have learned and where our books came from is from living our lives. I didn't set out to write a story about a group of Pakistani kids living in the UK who encounter an Indian girl. That's what happened to me, right? That was my life.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I think when you live your life, you create stories, and if you want to write them, the page is yours. So that would be my little bit of advice. What would you tell them?
First of all, I really high five you on that, because 50 toughest questions was my way of understanding and figuring out my own stuff. I said, let me ask myself some hard questions. And
Yeah,
if I'm able to answer that, maybe I'll find a way through into understanding other people. And I mean, it happened so beautifully that I wanted to pen it down in a book and, not necessarily start by writing a book. So I completely second you on that. Live and live as meaningfully and as authentically as you can. Yes, of course, people will make you feel reduced about your voice and your story, but that's inconsequential. You write anyway. My advice would be start by describing for what you had for breakfast this morning, and then go back 400 years to your great grandfather's great grandfather having the same breakfast and write from his voice, or your grandmother and her grandmother and their voice about this breakfast, and hopefully you will get a perspective that is, in difference, trying to provoke some sort of an inspiration within you about how even you're sitting on this page and wanting to write is a privilege. And I think when people work from a place of privilege, they can do so much, because you're not fighting for the basics, you're not fighting just for an idea. You
yeah,
have a lot of it.
yeah. I think it's so much about also acknowledging that privilege, right?
Yes. Oh, I think that should be the first chapter in every school that should be taught.
I think that's the other thing that writers do, and I know we really do have to wrap up. So,
No,
I'll
please
just say this.
complete that thought. It's beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but just the fact of acknowledging privilege, the fact that we get to tell our stories is a privilege because there are so many who don't. And I think one of the greatest things we can do as writers, I'm sure you'll agree, is also use that space and give a voice to the voiceless
Hmm.
without actually taking away from them. So that is another thing that I try to do, tell the stories of those whose stories have not been told yet. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. And if you feel a sense of accomplishment in that retelling, then I think something has moved in the world where you don't feel like you need to blow your own trumpet. You can really be in the orchestra and feel comfortable. So
We are all
that
just part of the orchestra, so yeah.
absolutely. And I love that the privilege is the storytelling. And if you tell it as often, you are in a way showing gratitude for your privilege in acknowledging it and celebrating it. So yeah, I think that's a good key takeaway message even for myself. I have to ask you, are you working on a second book? Is there another story you are trying to retell?
There are a bunch of ideas I have for stories, but right now I'm working on my book of poems. So that'll be out in, I think, October with HarperCollins. So
Wow.
right now I'm completely working on the book of poetry. What about you?
I also have another book that I'm supposed to do with Penguin. I've just started structuring it. It's far from getting done, Karuna, so you might have to send me some inspiration to get started and get done.
You're going to hear from me as well when I'm, tearing my hair out, trying to get my book together. And maybe we can remind each other that all stories have been told. Just go ahead and tell yours.
All over again. Absolutely. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. This was so much fun.
Thank you. It's been fantastic. Thank you to Arth as well. And Deepak, we'll catch up soon. I hope everyone watching enjoyed this.
Yes. Please tell your stories, and thank you again, Karuna.
Take care. Bye. See you.